apostrophes part one, or punctuation rather, part one. So apostrophes are used for two things as far as we are concerned: possessives, and there's a separate lesson on possessives and plurals, and then contractions, as in I can't for I cannot. So you've seen those before. I want to give you an example of contractions just while we're thinking of it. So I'm going to go all the way, just trust me for a second. I'm going to go all the way down here to the 80s. Have you seen this? Or you've maybe seen it written as like the 80s, right? That's wrong. That implies that the number 80, the 80 owns something, right? So like the 80 owns a car, which is insane. Apostrophes are for contractions. They show you that you've left something out, right? So can't is a contraction of cannot. And so when I take these two letters out, I put the apostrophe in to show you, hey, something used to be there, right? That's why it's the 80s, because it's plural, so you don't add an apostrophe there to make something plural, right? So if I had two farms, then I'd take, one farm, two farms, right? This apostrophe lets you know that I've left out the 19 because it's the 1980s, right? And then if I leave out the 19, then I go the 80s. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so that's how apostrophes work in terms of contractions. So it's is a little confusing because both forms could fit the rule. Just stick with me. So it apostrophe s is it is. So it's hot out. So the card needs its sunshade. This is the possessive pronoun, right? So if I said it's hot out, so the dog needs her sunshade, right? So it apostrophe s is it is. Okay, it is hot out. So let's get Ms. Milstead's sunshade. So this is a possessive right here. This is a contraction of let us. It's just a really old-fashioned sounding way to talk about it, right? The dog needs its leash before we leave, because the dog doesn't need it is a leash. The dog needs its leash. Just like you could say the teacher needs her book so she can teach the class or whatever, right? And then the last thing we're going to talk about in this video today is with quotation marks. So here's a quotation marks cheat sheet from Mr. Andrews. He's one of the AP Lang teachers. And so if you want to kind of use that, it's a really, really great resource. Here's the way we're going to test you on the quiz. So punctuation almost always goes inside the quotation marks. There are some exceptions, and you only have to deal with citations as far as us quizzing you, okay? So look here for number one, the period is inside the quotation mark. The only exception to that is when you have a parenthetical citation like you're going to do in the research paper, and I'm going to get to that in a later video, okay? So if you look at this sentence, the comma is inside the quotation marks, period is inside the quotation marks. So again, your punctuation is going to be inside the quotation marks unless you're doing a parenthetical citation, okay? The poem Blah by John Smith is pretty blah, right? So comma goes inside the quotation marks. Now, you'll notice question marks are a little bit difficult, and semicolons work in the same way as question marks. So did you know blah? The quoted part is part of the whole sentence. So the question mark here goes outside the quotation marks because blah isn't a question. Blah is a quotation that is part of the question. But if you look at this one, blah is a question, so the question mark goes inside. Does that make sense? So the question mark only goes inside the quotation marks if the stuff inside the quotation marks is the question. You got me? So that's the only tricky part. Periods and commas are always going to be inside the quotation marks unless you're doing a parenthetical citation. And if you're thinking, Ms. Milstead, this is unnecessarily complicated, why do we do it this way? Great question. I will acknowledge that the British system is easier than ours. Sorry to say, because theirs is just all punctuation is always outside the quotation marks. Sorry to tell you. So here's how you punctuate titles, and this is really important when you are writing essays for us, obviously. So the general rule is you underline a title when you're handwriting, italicize when typing, if it is anything large published by itself. If it is published as a small thing, it's part of a larger work, then it goes in quotation marks. So for example, a novel, a movie, an album, anything published by itself is going to be either italicized when you type or underlined if you're writing by hand. Now listen, a lot of kids try to like italicize their handwriting when they're writing an in-class essay. No, you underline it. That's wrong. Don't do it. Quotation marks, again, are for things published as part of a larger work. So if it's a short story, short stories aren't published in book form by themselves. They're published as a part of a collection. Now you might see a short story by itself in a magazine, but when it's published as part of a book. So a song, for example, is usually part of an album. So, somebody might cut a single off their album, but the song is part of a larger work, right? A larger body of work. So the album title would be italicized or underlined. The song title would be in quotation marks. Okay, so poem, the same thing. You wouldn't put out a book that's only one poem. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule, but they're pretty weird. Okay. So A, the novel Things Fall Apart. So this is underlined. That would be if you're writing by hand. Okay. Chinua Achebe wrote the novel Things Fall Apart. So this is italicized. So if you're typing. I love Archibald MacLeish's poem Ars Poetica. That's in quotation marks. Now I want you to notice two things here. I've got the period inside the quotation marks, which is correct. And there's no comma before. So you guys like to write the novel, comma, Things Fall Apart, or the poem, comma, Ars Poetica. And that's insane. It doesn't make any sense. You're implying that there's only one novel in the whole world or only one poem in the whole world. And I know that you probably wish that were the case, but it isn't. So there's no comma before the title of a poem or whatever, okay? I mean, there are some exceptions to that rule, but like in general, when you're writing a sentence like this, don't do it. If you look at D, Drake's song, Six God has misogynistic lyrics. I was obviously upset about something when I wrote this question, or when I wrote this example, but this is correct. So his song, Six God. So notice there's no comma here because I've got to narrow down. This is restrictive. I'm narrowing down which of his songs. He has multiple songs. And it's in quotation marks because it's a song, so it would be published as part of an album, okay? The movie title here is italicized because I'm typing. Now, I want you to look at E. So this is an example this is an exception that I was talking about before. So I love the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, comma. But, so I've got comma, conjunction, independent clause, right? The most famous song from the soundtrack, oh yeah, is Annoying. So I've got a comma here before the title of the song. And that's because the title of the song is an appositive. It's unnecessary information. I could pull it out and still have a complete sentence. So the most famous song from the soundtrack is Annoying, right? I could even just say, so whatever. I don't have to give you the name of the song. And notice, of course, my comma is inside my quotation marks here. And the short story, The Most Dangerous Game, freaks me out. That is both grammatically correct and correct in terms of content. I don't know if you've ever read that short story, but it is pretty freaky. So I hope that helps. I want you to take a minute, commit that to memory. You're going to need it in 10th grade. You're going to really need it in 11th grade. Okay. So we're going to talk about citations and with quotations here. So first of all, here's your punctuation with citation. So Milstead notes that blah, parentheses, 2016 and parentheses, right? So I don't have Milstead in my citation because I've got it in my sentence. Notice there's no comma before the quotation. I'm going to explain that down here, so stick with me. Milstead notes that blah. So then I've got a space. I've got my parenthetical citation. The period goes after the citation. So the reason for that is that the citation is part of the sentence that you're citing. That's why you put the period at the end of the citation. And you keep the citation as part of the sentence you're citing so that all that information stays together, okay? Blah is true, Milstead 2016, right? Because here, Milstead is outside the citation because I have it in the sentence. Here, Milstead is not in the sentence, so I needed it in the citation. So for semicolons, they're going to go outside the parenthetical, or they're going to go outside the quotation marks. And it's because the semicolon isn't part of the thing you're quoting. It's a way to connect to independent clauses, okay? Now here, there's no citation, so I put the period inside the quotation marks, all right? So I'm assuming that this example would be something informal, like if I were just telling you something that Dr. Mahan said, right? Now, colloquialisms, you can do either 3A or 3B. If you say the so-called blah effect, right? Or the blah effect in quotation marks. So-called does the same thing as the quotation marks. So-called means like, I mean, people call it that. I'm not real sure. So you're sort of casting doubt. And that's exactly what the quotation marks do. They're like, the blah effect, but like, right? So they do the same thing. So you can't go the so-called quote blah effect end quote. You can only do one of those two things. Now, if you're deciding whether to put a comma in front of a quote, here's what you decide. Here's how you decide. It's whether the quotation fits the syntax of the sentence. So look at the first one. Mr. Brown said, "I really like Miss Milstead." That doesn't fit the syntax of the sentence because the pronoun there, is Mr. Brown. But is Mr. Brown the one speaking? No. So you're imagining like I'm speaking here. Mr. Brown said, "I really like Miss Milstead." That would imply that Mr. Brown said, "I really like myself," and I'm referring to myself in the third person. Like, that's crazy. So obviously the I means that this quotation does not fit the syntax of the sentence. So you look at the second example. Mr. Brown said that he loves to do the cha-cha slide. That quote fits right into the syntax of the sentence. Imagine if you deleted the quotation marks, would it still make sense? The first one, no. The second one, yes. Right? In the second one, if you delete those quotation marks, it still makes total sense. I'm just pointing out that this is a direct quote, right? So that's how you know. Pretty quick video, huh? A quick video on this last section here. So first, for single quotation marks, you will almost never use these in your entire life, okay? You are only going to use a single quotation mark if it's inside a double quote. So that means that you're quoting someone who's quoting someone else. So two people are being quoted here. You're almost never going to do that. So in this example right here, GSMSC students are great because they work hard. So see how the single quoted part is inside the double quoted part? And that's like if the double quoted part is from Mr. Brown and just the word great is from Miss Fowler, right? So then I'm quoting Mr. Brown, who's quoting Miss Fowler. You're never going to do that. That's virtually never going to happen. So if you're like, oh, I'm going to put single quotes here, the answer is almost certainly no. So for parentheses, here's how you do punctuation. If the parentheses part is only part of the sentence, then you keep the punctuation as if it's a full sentence. But the punctuation would go inside the parentheses if what's inside the parentheses is a full sentence, right? I like your dog. I like you a lot. Those are full and complete sentences. If the whole thing's inside the parentheses, then the punctuation goes inside the parentheses as well. But again, if you look at A and D, and those are examples of the punctuation has to be outside because you're punctuating the whole sentence. You're not only punctuating the part in parentheses, right? So look at E. I wondered, since you asked, but I didn't want to ask, this comma is part of the sentence, right? You could just delete the stuff in parentheses. I wondered, comma, but I didn't want to ask, comma, conjunction, independent clause. So this would be correct without the parentheses. That's why the comma goes outside, okay? So some online quizzes, some extra resources here. You can quiz yourself. So there are some incorrect things here, and then the answers, you'd have to scroll down to get the answers. So you could pause the video here and kind of figure out where the apostrophes go.